So our next talk or panel is about the importance of state certification programs in election technology, and I'm going to turn it over to Christina here from the Secretary of State's office in Texas, and you can introduce yourselves.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for having us here. Thank you to Susan and the other organizers for inviting us to participate today. My name is Christina Adkins, and I'm the Director of Elections for the Texas Secretary of State's office.
And I'm Chuck Pinney. I'm one of the staff attorneys here at the Texas Secretary. Ooh.
We can just stand.
Yeah, how's this? Okay, we'll do this.
Okay. I can, if I knew where the volume was. Where's the volume? I just need to speak louder.
Yeah.
Is that better? No? Project more. That is not a problem for me.
Okay.
So where were we? Chuck Pinney.
I'm a senior staff attorney at the Texas Secretary of State's office. I work on the voting system and poll book certification programs. And today we're going to talk about the importance of state certification programs for election technology. We're also going to talk about some notable compliance issues that we came across and how we dealt with those along the way. We'll go ahead and get started.
Go ahead.
So federal and state certification programs are basically designed to make sure that systems meet certain technical standards and certain legal standards. It's not the only part of an important process for ensuring system security. There's a lot of different things that go into it. Voting system certification is a big part of it. At both the federal and state level, you have certification requirements. And having both programs is really important. At the federal level, they test to the voluntary voting system guidelines and making sure that those systems meet those standards. At the state level, we try to go a little beyond that and look at both state-specific requirements, but also try to look at things that maybe federal testing can't uncover. Part of the process for voting system security is also making sure that the system is working properly for every election that you're actually running. Pre-election testing is a huge component of that. You'll hear a lot of talk about logic and accuracy testing. In Texas, we require that for every election. We also require hash validation for every election on every device that's used with the system. Post-election audits are another important part of that process. You want to make sure that your system is working well both before you conduct the election and afterwards. So in Texas, we have manual count verification procedures where you go back and do a hand count to confirm the system results to make sure it was functioning properly. In 2026, we're also going to have risk limiting audits as part of our program. One thing I don't have on the slide that I really should have included here is physical security. Physical security is a really important component to ensuring voting system security in an election to make sure that bad actors can't gain physical access to the equipment, because without an internet connection, that's really the easiest way that you could gain access. It's important to make sure that you have solid chain of custody procedures, locks and seals on the equipment at all times to make sure that people can't get access to those machines or that any access to those machines is detected. The last compliance measures is the last thing we want to talk about. You know, if you run into a situation where you determine that a system is not complying with those standards or is operating in an unsecure way, you need to have some remedy to be able to address those issues and make sure they're resolved. So Christina is going to talk a little bit about those compliance measures and some of the steps we've had to take in the past. So just to give you an overview of what our certification program looks like here in Texas, we have two comprehensive programs that we run at the moment. Our voting system certification program is relatively old. It basically goes back to HAVA, and through that program, we make sure that any voting systems used in our state function according to those federal and state standards. Our poll book certification program is a little bit more recent. We established that in 2019 through the authorization of the legislature. So it's gone through a couple of iterations over the life cycle of the program, but it's really helped us a lot to have the ability to review and certify. We have about 8 different poll book vendors in our state, so it's really important that we have some mechanism to review them and make sure that we obtain compliance with the requirements for those. A lot of the conversation in the election community over the last several years has been about election supporting technologies and whether certification programs should be developed for those. Voter registration systems are part of that conversation. Ballot on demand systems are also part of that conversation. The EAC at the federal level is looking at certification programs for things like election night reporting systems and ballot delivery systems. We haven't quite gotten there for those last two, but we do have limited oversight over things like voter registration systems when counties use third-party systems to manage their voter registration data, and ballot on-demand systems where counties print hand-marked paper ballots at the polling place for their voters. So we'll start by talking a little bit about our voting system certification program. State law gives our office the authority to certify electronic voting systems in the state of Texas. Before any county or local entity can use the system, it does have to be certified by our office first. The election code provides pretty rigid structure for how our certification program is run. First and foremost, the system has to be certified at the federal level. Before we can even look at it or consider it, we have to make sure that the EAC has reviewed it, that it's gone through VISTL testing, and that it's at least passed the basic initial stage of review and confirmed to comply with the VVSG, at least in the eyes of the federal authorities. Once that step has been reached, the voting system vendor will send us in an application. That application includes a technical data package where they provide all the operator manuals and all the relevant system procedures documentation. The voting system test laboratories will provide us a copy of the trusted build, which is the source code of the voting system and how that system runs. They also have to pay an application fee as part of that process, and that application fee is what we use to pay our examiners. So really, the biggest strength of our program is our independent examiners and the way that they're able to work within our program to analyze the system on a deeper level. So the way our program works is we have 6 examiners. We have 3 legal examiners and 3 technical examiners. The legal examiners, I serve as the examiner for the Secretary of State's office. The Attorney General's office appoints 1 legal examiner, and then another attorney is appointed by our office. We also have 3 technical examiners who are all independent, don't work for any government agencies. We appoint 2 technical examiners from our office, and then the Attorney General's office also appoints a technical examiner. Once we have our team together, we conduct an exam. The exam takes several days. We look at a whole lot of different aspects of the system. The way we run our exam process is that it's partly structured and partly free-flowing. We have a few things that we have to do as part of our process. We do hash validation, we perform an installation from the trusted build, we go through a logic and accuracy test to make sure that the system operates correctly, and then we do accessibility testing to make sure that the accessible features on the device are working correctly as well. Once we've done that, it kind of opens the door up for our independent examiners to ask tough questions and look at whatever aspects of the system they want to. They're given the TDP a few months in advance so that they can go through the documentation in detail and decide these are the things that don't make sense to me from what I'm reviewing, or these are the things that I want clarifying questions. They get an opportunity to cross-examine the vendors during the exam process, and then once we actually have the equipment in the room, they can play with the equipment and we can look deeper into those issues that they've already identified or get follow-up answers to the questions that they have. So that's really the strength of our exam process, is that opportunity for these outside examiners to come in and look at these issues with the system that may not have been caught during federal testing. Federal testing has a very rigid process where they're following a strict testing manual to look at specific issues for every system. Because we have this free-flowing aspect to our exam process, we can look at things that might not be caught during the federal process. So once the exam's completed, our examiners write public reports that we post on our website that detail these are all the issues we identified with the system, this is how they were resolved, and then they'll make a recommendation about whether or not to certify the system. Once that's done, we hold a public hearing. Members of the public can reach out or appear at a public hearing and comment on whether we should certify the system, and then the secretary will make her decision based on the examiner reports and based on the public comments whether that system should be certified. So there are a few things that we have to look at by law when we're looking at voting systems for certification, making sure that the system operates accurately, making sure it preserves ballot secrecy. But some of the standards that we work with in our voting system certification program are very intentionally broad. You'll notice that the second one on that list is suitability for its intended purpose, and that's a very broad and subjective category. And the reason that's really important for us is that you may have situations where you have a very strict list of items that a voting system has to meet, and maybe that system meets that checklist of items, but there's some other flaw or some other design issue with the system that makes it fundamentally unsuitable for a county to use or for voters to interact with. So suitability for its intended purpose has been a really important standard for us to be able to look at issues that fall outside of that rigid framework and take action, create conditions on certification, deny certification based on a system's failure to meet that standard. So outside of the exam process, we also have the ability to review minor modifications to systems. This happens very frequently. The testing process for voting systems at the federal level typically takes about 2 to 3 years to get a system from its start to the finish when it comes to that testing process. So ECOs and minor modifications are really important because it's the opportunity to make small changes like end-of-life replacements for printers or minor components, security updates, things like that. The minor modification process gives us the ability to review those a little bit more quickly outside of those longer time frames. So we have the ability through our process to either review those based on written reports or by holding another in-person exam if it's a bigger change that requires deeper review. So that's our voting system program. We also have poll book certification program. Like I said, this is a newer program. We developed it in 2019. In 2019, the legislature created an electronic poll book certification program in Texas. When the program was created, there really wasn't a whole lot in the way of poll book certification within the states. The EAC hadn't adopted any kind of certification program for poll books, and I think at that time there were probably 6 or 7 other states that had just started the process for doing so. So we borrowed a lot of ideas from the other states when we were doing it, but for the most part, when we started out on that process, Christina and I had to kind of start fresh and build a program from the ground up. So it's gone through a couple iterations. I think we've had 3 really big revisions to the program over its life cycle, but the fundamental process has mostly been the same, which is that when the vendor applies for certification of a poll book, we look at the functional and technical compliance. We set out a list of functional standards and we do rigorous in-house testing to make sure that that system works, but we have to rely on the VISTLs for testing of the technical aspects. With voting systems, we have very clear authority to hire independent examiners and have them perform that testing process. With poll books, because we don't have that same legal authority, we rely on the test labs to do the technical testing there. So as they go through the process, they submit an application, they submit it to the test lab to test against our functionals or against our technical standards. We perform in-house testing against the functional standards, and then ultimately we decide whether the system can be certified at that point. There have been situations where we've required additional third-party testing. If a vendor is brand new to the Texas market, they don't have any kind of proven track record of functioning well in our market, that's a system where we may require additional third-party testing. There was one example of a situation where we had a vendor that was decertified for specific reasons, and Christina might talk about that a little bit more. In that situation, we required the vendor to go through additional third-party testing to make sure that those issues were resolved. That's outside of the VISTL process, but kind of a second layer of due diligence to make sure that those systems are working well. Like our voting system program, we have a minor modification process for poll books. Most often we end up doing an in-person review because the way poll books work requires so much direct interaction with the system, but we do have the ability to kind of take a focused approach and look specifically at those changes in between our annual certifications of those devices. So that's really the summary of our program. I'm going to pass it off to Christina to talk through the rest.
All right. So I think this is probably the part that most people want to hear us talk about, is why we think that state certification programs are beneficial to the election community, and what issues and what things that we have found through certification that we think have been game changers, what I would say, for our election world, because we have been fortunate enough to identify things within the certification process that have led to greater fixes within the voting technology that's out there. And we really take this very seriously. So let's tell you a little bit about kind of how we do this and what we've found. So one of the things about state certification is that when you have a certification program, it gives you the ability to help drive the development of new systems. Particularly in a state like Texas, where we have a very large market share, when we identify issues in an exam and we ask vendors to remediate those issues, they listen to us, because if they can't get certified in Texas, then they can't sell their product in Texas. And I think that's a very, very important thing to hold on to, is that we can make meaningful change in the development of these systems by enforcing requirements and enforcing, I think, security standards within our certification process. It is very important to us in Texas that our certification process be as transparent as possible. So when our examiners put together their reports, those are posted on the website for anybody to review. And you can go to our website now and you can go back and you can look at exams for probably the last 20 years or so, the documentation that's on there, to see what things our examiners identified that where they had concerns, or even you can see the things that they think a vendor is doing right. And one of the things that I've noticed, I've been working in this space now for about 13 years, is that when my first exam that I did was in 2014, and I noticed, looking back, when I look at those examiner reports, I can see examples of things that vendors have modified and changed based on recommendations that our examiners cited in our reports. So that change doesn't always happen immediately, but putting a recommendation in writing and posting it on our website where the community can look at it and review it has yielded change and has yielded improvements. The other thing that we've been able to do through our certification process, and that I really hope that other states consider doing if they consider adopting a certification process, is that it's not just a straight up or down certification or a denial of certification. We do have the ability to place conditions on a vendor and conditions on the use of that equipment. And that's something for us in Texas that has proven to be very valuable. If you go back and look at our certifications, you'll see a number of vendors that are certified with conditions, meaning that they have to comply with the requirements we're setting forth in order to continue using that product in Texas. If they don't, that would give us the ability to withdraw that certification. And we had a persistent issue that was coming up with one of our vendors. And it's kind of a silly issue. We have a requirement in Texas that you have 2 different locks with 2 different keys on ballot or on voting devices or scanners that are used during the early voting process, so before Election Day. And my goodness, we had the hardest time in the world getting vendors to take this requirement seriously and provide to their customers the right locks on these devices. So we started putting this in our certification order. We started putting this as a condition of certification, that the system had to be equipped with these locks in order to maintain their certification. And the compliance in that area improved dramatically when we put it in the certification order, because now I had something that I could point to. I had a law that I could point to before, but I didn't have an enforcement mechanism. But now I have something that has teeth to it, because I can tell a vendor, if you're not doing this, then we can remove your certification here in Texas. And that has helped in getting people to take this requirement more seriously. I also think it's important with these certification programs that, well, anytime you have a certification program, and with what we do in Texas, again, to emphasize the need for these programs to be transparent. It's one thing to say that you have a certification program, but another thing entirely to invite the public into that process and let them see what you're doing. Now, while our exams itself are not open to the public, the actual process where our examiners are working with the vendor, and we do that because they're in today's world, there's proprietary information there, and we need our examiners and our vendors to have a space where they can discuss and dialogue openly. Again, all of those reports are posted on our website. We do have a public comment period where people can submit comments, and we do want that feedback. We do want and solicit feedback on the systems itself. We want to solicit feedback from the individuals out there that are utilizing these systems. We get a lot of voters that are interested, that tell us about their perspective, tell us what they think about the system itself. It's what we appreciate kind of in that process. There are folks that will show up to our public hearings that just want to talk about why hand counting is the only thing that we should do. And I understand that there's a need for that discussion, and there's points that need to be made in that area. But we do have folks sometimes that participate in this arena that have very specific examples or specific experiences that they can share with us that help inform that certification decision. And I think with respect to the value of certification, and kind of closing in on this slide, I think one thing that's important to remember is that if you do a certification program correctly, you do have the ability to make changes that impact the rest of the country. Not every state has something like Texas. There are states that have certification programs. Some of them are more or less like a demonstration of the equipment itself, and they're not providing the ability for this system to undergo true scrutiny, in a controlled environment. And because we do that in Texas, because we give controlled access to the equipment to a group of really smart, intelligent, critical thinkers that are looking at it, from a holistic perspective, we have been able to identify things that other states don't identify. And if every state did something like Texas was doing, we would make great advancements in securing and improving the election technology that's in use today. So what are these compliance measures that we have to ensure that the systems are functioning as required and as intended? I mentioned, just broadly speaking, a certification program in general gives you the ability to do that. It gives you the ability to have some kind of enforcement mechanism on how this equipment's used. First and foremost, if somebody's coming in for certification, when you deny certification to a vendor, that's a pretty big deal because they're no longer allowed within your state or within your jurisdiction. Now, offering denial of certification to an existing vendor that has a substantial market share within your community, that sends a message with respect to compliance issues. Preventing a vendor from coming into your state because of denying their certification is also a pretty big deal because most vendors, when they're seeking contracts in other states or seeking certifications in other states, what we've noticed is a lot of states have disclosure requirements. If you've been denied certification or decertified in another state, you've got to disclose it to the new jurisdiction in which you're seeking certification. So when we deny certification on a system in Texas, that does have a ripple effect, and we can point to situations where we've gotten calls from other states wanting to know about our process and what we discovered and wanting to know why we didn't certify a specific system. I already mentioned the idea of conditions on certification, where we can condition the use on being performed a certain way or having certain procedures in place. Re-examination of a certified system, there have been times where there have been changes or things that have been brought to our attention where we believe a system needs further additional review. And so we do have the ability within our state program to call a vendor back in to reevaluate that situation and reevaluate that certification. And so that's a good tool so that it's not, again, just a straight up and down denial or certification. If you find that there's things that need to be further investigated, you have the ability to do that. Third-party review. Chuck made reference to this earlier, but we have recently, with our e-poll book program, we had a vendor that we decertified, and in order for them to come back and seek certification again, we opened the door for a requirement for some additional third-party testing. Right now in our community, because we are tied to the federal certification program and because there are limited labs out there that have the expertise on how to test voting system equipment, it's very hard to kind of expand beyond those parameters that people are used to. And so we saw an opportunity here where we were not comfortable with what had transpired, and I'll get into more details here in a moment, but we took that opportunity to try to expand beyond the labs that were currently being used to bring additional ideas and additional mechanisms for testing into the process itself. And then, of course, decertification, as I mentioned already. Having that ability to tell a vendor that they can no longer be used in your state is a pretty powerful tool that can allow for a substantial amount of change. So to give you some highlights on some of the issues that we have discovered. A number of years back, I think it was about 10 years ago, we had a vendor that came in. And back at that time, Texas had a straight party voting requirement where people were allowed to straight party vote. We also have the requirement where many races have write-ins, where you can do a write-in vote. In our testing, in our state testing, we discovered a problem when there was straight ticket voting and write-in ballots or write-in votes that had been selected on that equipment. And when you tried to tabulate those results, it created an error that made those results unreadable. And we discovered this in the course of our certification, something that had been missed by the test labs, that had we not tested that, would have been absolutely catastrophic in Texas, where we have a significant number of write-in votes, particularly for president. But because we identified this in our certification process, the vendor was able to make necessary remediations to prevent something that would have been catastrophically bad for our state. We have another situation where we had a vendor that was new to Texas, that had never come to Texas before, had never been allowed to sell in the Texas market. And we like competition. We don't want to be necessarily reliant on one vendor. That's our model in Texas. And so in the interest of having more competition, we want more vendors to come into our state so our communities, our counties have options. So this was a vendor that did not have a presence in Texas. In the course of our certification exam, we found that this system was not suitable for our Texas election process. I will say kind of broadly that it was our determination that the system was overly complex and we had some concerns about hardware issues that we had discovered that the vendor couldn't properly give us answers to. And so we're not going to subject our counties in Texas and our voters in Texas to uncertainty with their voting devices. And so for us in Texas, the right decision was to not allow for certification, to deny certification of that system. More recently, and this one's had a lot more publicity, is that we identified some issues with another vendor with respect to hash validations. We have one of our examiners that has really taken interest in hash validations because he sees this as a tool that can be used to help us test our equipment and help our local jurisdictions test the equipment as well. And with respect to the hash validation issue, what happened is he was actually running the hashes on his own. He made a mistake when he was running the hashes and forgot to copy the hash into the verification tool and ran it without the hash being in there, and he got a message that there was a match, that everything matched up, even though there was no hash to compare it to. So this led to us discovering a problem in that underlying script that was creating a false positive here. And while hash validation was not widely used in Texas at that time, about a year later, a law was passed that required this as part of our pre-election logic and accuracy testing. And since that time, we have had a number of other issues with respect to hash validation because it's a complicated process to implement across a state like Texas. But had we not identified that in the testing process, in our certification process, this would have gone undetected. We would have had a law that passed that could have put a requirement in place that our jurisdictions would have had trouble adhering to a certain extent. And then finally, the most recent thing that's happened, period, with respect to certifications has to do with our e-poll book situation. We had an e-poll book that was used in Texas in November in 2024 that had an issue that came up in the course of the 2024 election. And with that particular issue, what was happening is there was a delay when somebody was selecting print to print a code that goes on the top of the ballot that's used for activating the voting device. There was a delay. And so what our polling place workers were doing is they would hit the button again. And they'd hit it again and again and again, and this was all stacking up in the print queue. And a couple of things were happening. One, hitting it too many times was actually causing this very strange cascading effect of windows on the poll book, and then it would power down, it would shut down, and you'd have to restart it. When that happened, it was not clearing the print queue. So voters are coming in to check in, and you've got somebody where a ballot was sent to print 5 times. Next voter in line is getting the ballot that was originally sent to that print queue. And it was not until that print queue was cleared out that you were able to make sure that voters were getting the correct ballot style. We discovered this in the course of the November 2024 election. We were able to work with the jurisdictions that were impacted to come up with a solution that didn't disrupt their election any more than it had already been disrupted. And as a result of that, because this didn't perform the way it was supposed to perform, we decertified this poll book. And I think that's an important component here, is that you cannot be afraid to take those necessary actions. If you are afraid to decertify, then your certification program has little value. And so that was something the action that we took. And though some states, I think, are hesitant to do that, for us it was important because we're talking about a compliance issue, we're talking about a performance issue, and something that directly impacted voters and the accuracy of our elections. And then I think in closing, because I know we're running out of time here, I think we have an opportunity right here. It's been 20 years since we have had the ability to work under new voting system standards. And the EAC recently adopted the 2.0 standards. They're now working on the 2.1 standards. This is a clean start in some ways for, I think, states that are out there and jurisdictions that are out there that are seeking new equipment. And while I hope that the EAC, and I've expressed this to them, that they work on coming up with a better schedule that we can stick to when it comes to promulgating new standards, and that this is something that's happening more frequently so that we can make predictable updates and changes. Right now, because we have the first systems that have been tested under 2.0 coming out of the federal certification process, this is our chance to start fresh with these certifications. This is our chance to put our vendors, forgive me for saying it this way, but to put them through the ringer on the certification process and to make them earn these state certifications. Because once you start certifying a system and it gets out there and it's being used within the public, and you have jurisdictions that are making financial decisions, they're purchasing and procuring equipment, it's not easy to get vendors to make changes at that point. And so while we're doing these initial certifications under the 2.0 standards, this is our chance to really, truly investigate and look really hard at these systems to find the things that we want to improve upon and to find the things that we think could be potential problems for our voters and for our election officials. And for all of my other state officials that are here or that are watching the program or that may watch this recording at a later date, I really want to say that it is very important that we not be afraid of this type of inquiry. It is okay to give people controlled access to this equipment and to let them ask those hard questions. In fact, it's more than okay, I would say it's necessary to do that, because getting the right people in the room, the right critical thinkers, the people that are trying to look for solutions to problems, and helping us investigate this equipment and investigate these systems to find flaws, to find issues, or to find areas of improvement, that is how we strengthen the entire infrastructure. And so we cannot be afraid of this inquiry. It has to be something we have to be willing to do. We have to ask those hard questions, and we have to demand changes in order to get the systems where they need to be and to ensure that we have safe and secure elections. And so that's all we have for you today. Thank you. I know we didn't leave much time for questions, but Chuck and I are going to stick around. And so if anybody has any particular questions or anything you want to discuss with us, please let us know. Thank you.